Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord, your God. In it you shall not do any work. From the book of Exodus. From Mark's Gospel, we hear Jesus say that Sabbath was made for man. The context of that particular passage from Exodus is one of creation. God created the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day, he rested. And so that becomes then the litmus test for how we should live our lives. Something of the Sabbath, each day and each week. In particular, each week. The Sabbath day now is a Sunday. It used to be on Saturday for the Jews. And because that Sabbath day was so important to them, in many ways, Jesus' interpretation of the meaning of the Sabbath seemed to rankle them a little bit. They didn't like the way he was approaching it. Today, as Christians, we wrap up the resurrection in the notion of the Sabbath. And for us, the Sabbath is therefore a Sunday. The Sabbath was meant to do a couple things for the people of the Old Testament, for those Israelite people. It was supposed to remind them constantly of the fact that they had been released from slavery in Egypt. This was part of the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, to keep holy the Lord's day. Well, what does it mean to keep this day holy? It's to remember that God is the one who created everything, not us, and that on that seventh day we are to rest like he did. It's also there to remind these people that after their slavery, they are now free. And so in a sense, that seventh day of rest is a way for them to push back against a life filled with servitude, as they as slaves would have naturally worked all the time. There would have been no day off for a slave. Now they were free. And although they still needed to work, and God has sanctified work, he doesn't want work to be turned into another kind of slavery, where we have to do it all the time, with no rest whatsoever. Our response to the challenge of keeping the Sabbath is one that is difficult to maintain in the society in which we live, because the society in which we live seems to have gone back to a kind of slavery, where we have found that our thirst for work and accomplishment and money has taken over everything. And it's kind of made it normal. So when we think about going back to normalcy after this pandemic, what should that normalcy look like? And how can we make a choice to make it more look like maybe what God wanted it to be? Our reality of our lives is that we have become addicted to busyness, so much so that we don't even notice it. But we do notice it now, that we have been released from our calendars, as it were. So many of the things that used to take up our time aren't on our calendars, and we're starting to realize, you know what, we can survive. We haven't died because of the fact that we have less to do. And so what is it that we have discovered? Maybe we have discovered the Sabbath again. For what is the Sabbath except a shutdown? Except it doesn't carry with it the kind of results of this massive shutdown caused by this virus. This massive shutdown has been very destructive, without a doubt, to our economy, to people's lives, and because of the pandemic itself, to people's lives and security. There's no doubt about that. One doesn't want to have a pandemic happen. But the Lord likes to use things to help us realize stuff. He wants us to realize once again that maybe it's time for us to recapture the Sabbath. We think as Americans that we are completely in control. We'd like to be in control. We like to think we're in control, don't we? Control of our lives. We kind of are able to evaluate every little thing, and we're able to choose what we want to do. And by George, when somebody comes along and tells us you have to do it a certain way, we don't always go along with that. We kind of like do our own thing. Obedience, which is part of this notion of allowing someone else to have control, is something we as Americans aren't really used to. In the newspaper and in the constant news these days, these more recent days, there's the constant debate between personal freedom and common good. Personal freedom and common good. It's been going that way ever since the founding of our country. The balance between personal freedom and common good. The Supreme Court sides with personal freedom so much that it allows an individual to make a choice over another person's life, as in the abortion debate. It's not even a question of whether or not the baby is human or not. It's really a question of whether you have the power to make a personal choice. Your personal freedom becomes what trumps this notion of a common good like right to life. So when it comes to these addictions, whether it be to busyness or to control or to thirst for choice, every one of those things in one way or another has been uncovered, unveiled, revealed to us very clearly during this pandemic. And so when we go back to this normalcy, which we're starting to dabble into now, as your presence here tells me, we're starting to dabble into coming back, with some restrictions, and then those restrictions will be lifted, and then a few more as we become more secure, maybe as we start to realize that maybe we got some of these things on some control. Nonetheless, as we go back, how do we want to go back? Do we want to perhaps take back the Sabbath? I think that's a good question for us to ask. How can we make Sundays truly Sundays? Because there's really 2 or maybe 3 purposes for a Sunday, for this Sabbath day. We say the first one is always to go to church. But we can't just compartmentalize it and say, okay, I've gone to church, I've checked off that box, now I can go do whatever I want to. The fact that shopping has been made part of Sunday only tells me that the other 6 days are so cotton-picking busy that you don't have time to do that on those other days. And so how do we compartmentalize that away from Sunday? How can Sunday be a time when we worship God, but then we go to the next 2 things? The next one is family. Leisure and family. Leisure with family. When you look at the Decalogue, when you look at how the 10 Commandments are put together, the first 3 have to do with our loyalty and our devotion to God. And the last ones have to do with our care and love for our neighbor. But the first of those in caring for our neighbor is honor your father and mother. And generally speaking, that should be broadened to understand honoring your family, honoring your children, children honoring their parents. And how do you do that? Take a day and devote it to your family. Let it be something that sticks out from the other 6 as different. Play with them, play games with them, go camping with them, go fishing, go hunting, build a snowman, whatever it is. Play a game, watch a movie, cook together. Go visit the other relatives, invite family members over, visit the relatives who are in the nursing home. And that brings into the third part of Sabbath is somehow caring for the poor and the needy, or those who in a sense, that act of mercy. Take back the Sabbath. When we take back the Sabbath, we start to preserve the little bit of good we have really discovered, the little kernel of gold we've discovered in the midst of this pandemic. That we need to have a day when we just literally stop. Devote it to God and devote it to our families. Don't be pulled in 10 other different directions. It's going to be hard to do. We'll have to evaluate things like, our parish festival is an example. The dinner we have is always on a Sunday. Should we do that? Should we not do that? Would that, I'd be happy with us not doing it. Because, again, how do you be family? And maybe I'm being really radical when I say something to parents and I say, I'm just not too sure sitting in the stands and watching your kids play sports is necessarily family time. because you're not interacting with them. You can compare that now to the stuff you've been doing at home as a family. So evaluating all of our activities in the light of those two goals for the Sabbath day, or the three goals: worshiping God, caring for our family, and showing mercy. Take back the Sabbath. Let's take back the Sabbath.